Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone. I'm Charu Vardarajan from ESS-DIVE. And today we're going to be seeing the last of our webinars that are related to community data reporting formats. So for those of you who haven't joined, I see a lot of new names here in our participant list. It's great to see all of you. Welcome. ESSDIVE, for those of you who are not very familiar with us, is a DOE data repository that accepts environmental data that's related to the DOE's Environmental Systems Science program. That's the ESS program. And over the last year, we've had several community partners across various national labs working with us to develop data and metadata reporting formats for a variety of environmental data types. So since June, all our webinars are recorded and are available on our website, essdive.lbl.gov. And so over the last few months, we've had our community partners describing several different data standards that span both terrestrial ecosystem data sets such as soil restoration, leaf gas exchange, as well as water quality and hydrological reporting, hydrological data, as well as file level metadata. So today, we're going to wrap up our data reporting formats webinar series where we're going to be talking about two different aspects. One, we have established a community GitHub where we have these data reporting formats now documented. And anybody across, actually it's publicly available for anybody to comment on. And then we will also cover our final version of our sample ID metadata standard that we've worked on for the last over a year right now. Actually done a pilot test in the field with our prototype sample reporting format. So what we present here will be the final ESSDIVE standard or reporting format that we expect to go forward with and hope that people will start adopting. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rob, who will cover our GitHub first, and then Joan will take over and present on the sample ID metadata reporting format.
Thanks, Charu. And
before that, let me just say that this webinar is being recorded, so just keep that in mind. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Charu, and hi to everyone. Hi to those of you that I haven't had the chance to meet yet. It's nice to see you all on the call. And so I'm a postdoc working with the ESSDIVE repository. And I'm excited to share with you today how we're working with teams of our community partners across the network of national labs to document data reporting formats on the GitHub website. So Charu gave an introduction to the ESSDIVE repository, and I wanted to give another brief overview here, just because we do have some new folks on the call. For those of you that are new to this monthly webinar series too, I want to welcome you all. I'll just give this quick one-slide overview, and we're a cross-disciplinary data repository launched in 2018, so just a few years ago now. And we're designed to provide long-term stewardship and use of data, all different types of data, observational, experimental, and modeling activities in the earth sciences. So as you can see in that figure to the right, we at ESSDIVE store a really diverse type of data that span the scientific disciplines. And I'll emphasize throughout this presentation that a real core principle of what we do at ESSDIVE is to make sure that this diverse type of data that we store is as scientifically useful as possible when it's downloaded by users or contributed by uploaders. Quick overview of my presentation here for you all. First, I'll give you a general overview of how we as ESSDIVE are, with the help of all of our community partners, developing data reporting formats and using how GitHub can be used for long-term documentation of these standards. I'll show you the results of a systematic review I did that helped inform how we built our community space on GitHub. And then lastly, I'll give a a tour/demo of our community space on GitHub. So the general intro to data reporting formats and the GitHub platform. So one way to understand how data reporting formats and data standards in general enable better science is by kind of thinking about problems that arise if they're not used. So maybe some of you saw this Nature article from, well, a couple months back, that asked if we could, that issued this challenge asking if you can find and rerun your 10-year-old code. Well, I didn't really know how to write computer code back then. And that was a few laptops ago anyway, so the answer is probably no for me on this. But I'll pose another question today, which is, can you find and use your 10-year-old data? Now, one way to make data available long-term, hopefully even longer than 10 years, and more scientifically useful is through data reporting formats. So in these three boxes that you see at the top of the screen here, these are data reporting formats that were developed by teams at LBNL when we first began starting the ESSDIVE repository. Now, over the past year or so, we've been working with 6 teams of community partners to develop reporting formats to help and guide how data that are uploaded to the ESSDIVE repository are sort of formatted for across the different disciplines, ranging from soil respiration data to leaf physiology data to amplicon sequencing data. And as the teams of these community partners developing the formats were doing so, a key benefit is that they were able to tap into their community of DOE researchers and other researchers to kind of start achieving consensus on these data reporting formats. And this is where when they were achieving consensus on these reporting formats, is when we started to sort of explore GitHub as a platform for documenting and developing these formats. Okay, so I think it's safe to say that a lot of us have been in this loop here that I depict here of document editing, where it's tough to keep track of the most recent version of a document, tough to figure out what the final one is, especially when you go through multiple rounds of reviews, right? And so we needed a more nimble and transparent way of getting feedback on our data reporting formats. And as I show here, GitHub's a platform, and I'll show you lots of screenshots later in the presentation. It's a platform since about 2008. People have been collaborating on computer code and its system of what they call version control, which you can think of as kind of track changes. If you've, track changes or suggesting edits, makes it so that we all edit code and documents and get feedback from it all on the same website, and all of that is visible to the public. So recently, because more research teams are using the site GitHub, to collaborate on more text-based documents like our data reporting formats, text and spreadsheets. This kind of served as our jumping off point to figure out how to best host our data reporting formats for community collaboration. Some of the key underlying principles about this work is that we are community oriented at ESSDIVE, and so we wanted to make sure we always had the opportunity to get feedback from users. We wanted open versioning, so allowing these suggested edits from the community to get incorporated in new rounds of the data reporting formats, new versions. And we wanted our documentation to be as user-friendly as possible for both the data contributors to the repository and the data users down the road. So I'll go briefly into this systematic review I conducted that informed how we eventually built our GitHub site. So it turns out there are, of course, many groups using GitHub for version control of computer code, but some of the groups that I list out here actually use GitHub for documenting and managing both data standards and data reporting formats. So of course, not wanting to reinvent the wheel completely, I conducted this systematic search to identify some common methods from groups that use GitHub to document reporting formats. as you see here, I searched for different groups using GitHub to document reporting formats from the different domains that are captured in ESSDIVE. I found 95 groups that do this, but actually only 51 used GitHub to manage their standards. And so from this systematic search, this review that I conducted, sort of discarded the 41 groups that don't use GitHub. And then a lot of those groups, actually about 25 of them, just use GitHub to store static Word documents or Excel templates. And what we really wanted to see was groups that learn from were groups that use GitHub to actively manage the standard or reporting format and get feedback from their users. And so that left us with 26 different groups to inform this review that I did. Here's the results. So first, I took a comprehensive look at what type of content appears in these 26 organizations' GitHub pages. And those are also called GitHub repositories. And as you might expect here, I highlight that a lot of the groups, almost all of them, told us something about their standard or reporting format in an about section. And they let us know if they were on version 1 or a big version 2, big update to their standard or reporting format. But I wanted to note that some of these lower utilized kind of elements of GitHub repositories, like including a recommended citation or providing funding information, we think those are also really useful and incorporated them, as you'll see, into our GitHub community site. And yeah, stuff like including funding information is important, we think, probably for funders too. They probably like to see that, even though it was sort of underutilized in this review, as it turns out. Another key feature of GitHub that I've brought up a little bit already is that people that visit the GitHub sites or the GitHub repositories can collaborate on the documents they find there. And it all happens in publicly viewable ways through comments and edits. Surprisingly, just over half of these organizations that I surveyed make any mention of contributing on the repositories, and only about 30% or so provide detailed instructions for how to contribute. And because of our focus on making our documents and our sites as user-friendly as possible, I wanted to know whether groups tend to leave their reporting format documents on GitHub, or if they build like a separate user-facing website on top of their GitHub page. And it turns out 11 of these groups leave their work right on GitHub and have users interact with it there. But a large number build these HTML-based websites, or github.io websites, are sort of a separate thing, but more user-friendly than the standard GitHub pages. To briefly summarize the systematic review I did, we found 95 different organizations managing standards and reporting formats. 26 of those use GitHub. And while there's a variety in what groups decide to display on the website, we found some consistencies across those GitHub repositories, but only 50% mention contributing at all, even though this is a great feature of GitHub. And the user-facing site that these groups use is often the GitHub repository. All right, so next I'm going to go over show you our GitHub community space for ESSDIVE. And here you'll see some screenshots of the GitHub community space, like right here. And I think we're dropping a link to this page in the chat right now, but this is the home page that you'll see when you visit our ESSDIVE community space on GitHub. Right now it hosts documentation about our data reporting formats mostly, but we do envision and plan for this space to host community developed code that's related to the ESSDIVE repository or tools that interact with the repository. So one thing you don't see on too many GitHub sites, but that I want to point out here, is that we have this pinned repo that I've highlighted, this pinned page that I've highlighted in red here. This is sort of a meta repository that gives first-time GitHub users, or really any first-time visitors to our space specifically, a little orientation on how to do everything from starting up your GitHub account for the first time to creating and managing your own repository, all with our support of course, throughout this whole process. But just, we wanted to provide a little documentation to help people get oriented. When we click on that pinned repository, here's what we see. For those of you that haven't used GitHub before, I want to first point out that this is the typical view of most GitHub repositories. You see folder structure up at the top. You see the files that are contained in the repository as well. And I also want to point out that all of the pages that you'll see today, for the most part, are written in what's called the Markdown language. It's a type of coding language. But for any non-coders out there, don't let that deter you right away from working with GitHub at all. I think this quote's pretty appropriate in that if you can write an email, it's not much more of a learning curve to learning to write in this Markdown language. So of course, happy to share with you all resources about Markdown and all of that, but it's beyond the scope of this talk to go into that. But I do think this quote is a pretty accurate summary of how relatively easy it is to get these GitHub pages up and running. If we scroll down that meta repository README page a little bit, I just want to show you that we have detailed instructions for users at really any level of GitHub comfort to get up and running. So I'll leave that to you to scroll through at your own leisure, but here's a view, that was a little glimpse of our meta repository README file. Looking back at that meta repository folder structure that I showed you initially, I want to point out that these README files, these sort of landing pages that you see here, they're so important for each repository that gets generated on our community space, that we include this template for your README files based on some of the findings from my systematic review. And here's just a quick view of that. It includes other elements as well, but I just want to highlight that we think these getting started sections that help orient the visitor or reader to your repository and providing things like details on how to contribute are extremely important. And so we provide a template for anyone starting up a repository to use as sort of like the starting point. And another feature that I wanna point out that really is built into every single repository, it's called GitHub Issues. And the term GitHub Issues might not sound like a feature, but it really is. And this issue tab that you can find, as I said, on any repository, allows visitors to your repository, to your GitHub site, to suggest changes to your work. And now they're just suggestions, they don't instantly get incorporated or anything like that. But these issues are publicly visible so that any responses or suggested changes can be viewed by other users that might want to chime in on the decision-making process of the discussion happening. So here's an example from Joan's repository, which you'll see in the second half of the talk today, or the webinar today. I made a suggestion to Joan's repository, and which all of you could click on and see. I want to point out that Joan adopted another practice that we identified in the systematic review, which is to suggest a template for when users submit an issue to the GitHub repository. And so by filling out this template where I had to tell Joan the page that I wanted to change, who I was, and why I wanted to make the change, it does provide a little more structure and is probably a bit more useful for Joan when she sees this comment, knows exactly where to go and why I'm suggesting the change. Now, the way that we document our GitHub, the way that we document our GitHub repositories in the most user-friendly way possible is through this documentation tool called Gitbooks. And we're using this to make, as I said, our documents a bit more user-friendly. What it does is essentially mirrors the exact same structure of your GitHub repository, but already you can probably tell that from the images of the screenshots of the GitHub pages, this Gitbook renders as a website in a little more user-friendly way. You'll see here, every Gitbook gets automatically rendered, as I said, based on your GitHub repository structure with a table of contents over on the left, a search bar, and a table of contents for your individual pages on the right that help people just get the need to know information right from the page you're on. And another critical feature of this GitHub and a critical feature of really the Git book is that it's directly connected to the repository. So when we edit or make changes to the repository content on GitHub, the Git book content is automatically refreshed. And it can be really hard to maintain multiple versions of documents across multiple websites or platforms. And so this Git book, GitHub direct tie-in, automatic update really simplifies our lives quite a bit. We make all of our edits on GitHub, and it just, gets instantly updated in the more user-friendly Git book. And to wrap things up, I just want to outline the workflow from moving from our data format development to GitHub and beyond. So community researchers draft the reporting format and then move the documents to the GitHub repository that we set up with our community partners and community teams. When a version of that reporting format's finalized, it's then pushed over to a Git book. That's the user-friendly documentation, and also uploaded to ESSDIVE repository where it's issued a DOI. The formats can then be accessed by researchers that say want to contribute data to the repository. And importantly, those same formats can be accessed by data users, for example, data modelers, that want to suggest revisions to the reporting format, since the whole point of this is to make the data more useful downstream for data users and, of course, data contributors. This, and then there's the arrow that completes the editing process or the suggesting change process. So this slide also highlights some of the deficiencies of using GitHub. You'll notice that there are 3 different platforms where users can sort of access the reporting format, which can make interacting with the format a little bit clunky. Related is the idea that users can't submit issues through Gitbooks. They have to submit issues through GitHub. And there's a little bit of a learning curve to just getting comfortable navigating that GitHub user interface to submit issues. Now, that being said, we think the functionality provided by GitHub is enough of an incentive to hopefully propel new users over the GitHub learning curve. And just to summarize, GitHub's a platform for collaboration on not just computer code, but also documents like reporting formats. And there are many benefits, a few of which are version control and issue tracking, as we went over. And lastly, there are lots of different ways to display GitHub content on the web. But Gitbooks is a way to make sure those documents are user-friendly and automatically updated, so we're not duplicating any unnecessary work. And with that, I'll thank you all. I'm happy to take any questions that have popped into the chat. I wasn't able to follow along there. And then I do have a few poll questions for you all to maybe generate some discussion. So thanks everyone.
Hi there, this is Bill Duncan. I work with the NMDC. I was curious about a couple of things. One, do you have your license posted? I'm sorry, I wasn't following along. So are you? So this comes up in issues a lot that they want to know if there's any licensing descriptions. If you've used, like, for instance, Common Core, sorry, Creative Commons license.
Yes, thank you for that. Thanks for that question. And yeah, we have been thus far with our own material, and other ESSDIVE folks can kind of for sure chime in on this. But thus far, we've been licensing with CC by 4 for these more document-based repositories. And then we also are suggesting the same to our community partners, but from what I understand, generally leaving it up to them to sort of work with their organizations to figure out exactly what their licensing is going to look like, especially if they're uploading more like code, more scripts or computer code.
Right. So yeah, so I was looking, so on your community space, for example, I would suggest you put the license up front. And,
sounds good.
And make that kind of as to address this up front. Some other suggestions, are you familiar with badges?
You know, I tested it out on the Meta, maybe you can see them on the Meta repository. Is that what are badges those little like boxes that tell you whether issues are like open or closed? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, there's lots of them. Like, we use badges to display the license, to display the number of issues, the number of users. Anyway, but there's they're just a quick and easy way to display some basic information about your repository. That's all.
No,
It's not,
that's great. I
yeah,
haven't looked into them too much.
yeah, they're not too hard. That's yeah. Anyway, that's just a suggestion. I mean, badges seem to be a popular thing these days.
No, that's a great suggestion. Thanks for that. I see them used on GitHub sites a lot,
Yeah.
but I haven't used them too much myself. I'm sure some of our team members have, though.
Yeah. And then
And
one other thing.
Bill, this is Deb Agarwal. Just to further answer your question, we strongly encourage any of the community work to come in CC0 or CC by 4,
Okay.
particularly on these reporting formats, because otherwise they're not usable.
Right, right. And that's why I was like suggesting like display the licensing really right up front, right? Just because when I went to the
No,
GitHub,
great suggestion.
yeah,
Absolutely agree.
That's all. Just make it crystal clear like what the licensing is, so that way, you know, people can make up their minds appropriately, or at least be aware that what they're submitting is, say, CC0, and which means anybody can use it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The other thing I'll say, you didn't, so we often use a workflow. Are you familiar with GitHub workflows?
Not really.
Right. So you might want to read up on this. So say I'm, so also are you familiar with the Mixes like standards?
Yeah, I am. That was one of the sites I looked at as well.
Yeah. So I'm working with them like also. So say I want to make a change in the standards. Typically, so here's an example of a workflow, and there are variations like of this. All right. So I submit an issue, right? I need new term, whatever, X,
Yeah.
right? And then the workflow normally goes, so you create a separate branch, which is kind of like a copy of the whole repository, right? Yeah. Except it's managed real efficiently, you know. And so I create a branch, right? And then I go into that branch and I do my work, right? I add the term and definition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And then when I'm done, I submit what's called a pull request.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the pull request, other reviewers come in and they review the work that I've done. And if they approve the pull request, then that work gets merged back into the main branch. Yeah. And so that's a way of managing what goes into your final product, right? And also that creates a nice way to track the way the main repository develops, like over time, because you can see all the pull requests that have been done and what the issues were and the changes that like.
No, that I've seen that workflow on a few repositories that use GitHub for these reporting formats and standards. It's a great idea. I think right now we're sort of envisioning more of an issues, not issues only way of making comments and suggestions. I think, but right now, since we don't have that workflow fully developed, but I think that is a major benefit. These pull requests and working on things in tandem is a real benefit to using GitHub. So,
so I just posted.
Bill, sorry to cut you off. We still have half an hour for the sample ID presentation.
That's fine. I'm done. I'm just saying, just check out the gene ontology link that I posted.
Okay.
And you can see an example like of a workflow.
Great. Thanks so much for the comments. I'm going to turn it. Yeah, I'll stop sharing my screen here.
Yeah, thank you. And it sounds like maybe you and Rob might need a follow-up conversation. So, but thank you for all those great suggestions. I want to switch over to Joan, who'll cover the sample ID metadata standards reporting formats. And I know many of you are users of standards, including the Leaf Gas Exchange standards. So if you are interested in learning about how to submit an issue and provide feedback on a specific standard, Joan's going to cover that as part of her presentation. It's more focused towards the samples, but it's the same thing would apply for any other reporting format that's on the ESSDIVE GitHub. Go for it, Jim.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about some of the content in the ESSDIVE sample ID and metadata reporting format that we've been developing in partnership with a number of people who are listed here as co-authors from the environmental system science community. So what I want to do is give a review of some of the background work and testing that we've done to address specific ESS needs. And this includes things like addressing the interoperability of metadata for multidisciplinary work, looking into what we should be doing for sample relationships, tracking and linking related samples as they're published online, addressing an issue of efficiency of standardizing sample metadata, particularly for large sampling campaigns, and then go into some of the details about our documentation that is now on GitHub and Git Books. And then I'll conclude with some next steps and ways to provide feedback. I just want to mention that our overall goal here in developing this reporting format for samples is to support the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability of this sample data to maximize the value of the data over time and to also help improve the efficiency of sample tracking for multidisciplinary work in particular. So as some of you have heard before, early in our site visits as we were getting ESSDIVE up and running, we had a lot of feedback that projects were facing a particular challenge in efficiently tracking samples as they're sent to different labs and user facilities for a variety of different physical, chemical, and biological analyses, and then combined into different data files and published in different data sets and repositories. It turns out that integrating sample data effectively for these kinds of projects as data is transferred via these numerous files and published in different places, it really requires globally unique and persistent identifiers to do this effectively. So our approach was to have projects within the community test out use of the system for Earth sample registration to register their samples for global sample numbers that are designed specifically for physical samples. And these are called IGSNs, and standardize their associated metadata. So this metadata is always associated with the persistent identifier. So in the end, we had about 3,000 IGSNs registered across 8 different projects for this testing work that we did. This includes a variety of different sample types, and most of them were conducting studies on biogeochemical responses to things like climate, contamination, and other disturbances. And this really enabled us to test the use of IGSN core sample metadata across a variety of both geoscience and biology related samples. And what we learned really was that the multidisciplinary environmental system science work, these identifiers for samples can be a really powerful tool to link and track this complex information. And we identified some specific areas to improve the efficiency of the registration and the relevance of the standardization process for the actual metadata. And we're finalizing a paper on this that we'll be submitting pretty soon. And so we'll send a link to that around when it is published. In parallel to this pilot test, we also, for background research, created a translation table of related standards and vocabularies. And we use this to specifically identify areas to improve the interoperability of the geoscience and biological sample standards and templates. And this part of it was really focused on standards that people were using, like the IGSN core descriptive metadata, Darwin Core, which is designed for biodiversity records, and the minimum information about any sequence, or MIXS, which is focused on the genomic and metagenomic type of samples. This includes our final recommendations here include curated and subsets of vocabulary terms from the environment ontology and the plant ontology for key metadata elements. And we're also, to improve interoperability, we need to work on ways to better link the IGSN and biosample numbers within related identifier metadata, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. There was uncertainty among those who participated about how to allocate IGSNs in certain scenarios. And one of those was whether to assign a new identifier to subsamples or individual containers sent out for separate analyses. So part of this includes a consideration of the efficiency of registering potentially hundreds of samples that involved a lot of subsampling and replicates. So based on the pilot test feedback, options 2 and 3 here seem to be the preferred methods for assigning IGSNs to some of these subsamples, simply by adding a short 1 to 3 character extensions to a primary ID, which have to be unique, but can be meaningful or opaque depending on the needs of the project. Also, to avoid redundancy in data management, we moved towards this approach of some of the commonly used relational data models and also Darwin Core, which separates metadata. It allows the option of separating out metadata by higher level entities that kind of overarching of a particular sampling effort. These can be things like a project, a collection of samples, a site, or event. And what you can do is assign a set of metadata to a collection ID, for example, and use that as a mechanism to associate all of that metadata to the individual samples. Otherwise, that metadata can be separated. So we use the identifiers as a way to associate all of the important metadata that might be more efficiently provided at a higher level, like a collection, a site, or an event, to the individual samples. Another aspect of improving the usability of standard reporting formats like this is to coordinate across the user facilities and data systems that users are already interacting with in their work, particularly for multidisciplinary projects. Samples are one good example of how data may originate or exist in different systems. Just to give an example, a particular project may have FTICR analysis coming from MSL. Genomics data may be published on NMDC, and modeling work may take place on KBase. So the IGSN or another persistent ID can provide a powerful way for these systems to link and exchange information across facilities and data systems. So we're not quite there yet, but we are working across facilities to figure out how we might do this, and the persistent ID and the standard metadata are necessary components of getting this to work. Wait, there's one more point. So, and just to reiterate here, what this can do is help us link related data. It also expands access pathways and enables us to avoid having to enter the same information across different platforms. So our final recommended format accounts for some of this feedback that I've mentioned from our testing and our background work. And so we've created a revised documentation in GitHub explaining the sample ID and metadata reporting format. So here are the links to the GitHub and Git Book specifically for the sample ID and metadata repository. And as Rob described, the information is identical in both. It's just a matter of how you prefer to view it. And so I'll go through some of the detailed views of content for sample reporting. So right at the bottom here, you see the getting started, and that's where we'll go next. So getting started for this, we have the first section here is a link to the metadata reference guide, and this will include descriptions for each metadata element, and I'll show you a view of that next. We also have an instructions document that provides steps on how to register samples for IGSN through CSAR and submit a related data set to ESSDIVE. And then we have the sample metadata template that is a spreadsheet with standard metadata fields that you'll complete. So I'm actually first showing just a quick view of the instructions. And this is the sample metadata template, and you can download it from GitHub here. And it looks something like this. There's a header row with required information to register samples, the object type, and a user code. And this is a code that goes on the beginning of all of your IGSNs and is usually designated for a specific user or project. And here is the sample metadata guide. And because we have a lot of elements, we created a table of contents here in the beginning so we have about 12 required fields that are all marked with an asterisk, and there's also an indication of whether these are required in the detailed tables below. And we have them divided into logical categories. We have the header rows, which includes the object type and user code that I mentioned, the specific sample IDs and related identifiers. So each sample will have a project-specific sample name, which is it's most often a meaningful identifier for the project that they have assigned. That's always associated with the IGSN. We also have a number of fields to describe the physical sample itself, such as material, sample collection details like the collector and the date, location information about where the sample was collected, environmental context, which includes both the local environmental context and the biome or broader, and then details on access. So I'm going to show you some view of some of the details that we have, and I'll move on to object type and material to show some examples. So one important aspect of metadata for samples is to characterize what it actually is, and you do that to characterize a sample type. We use typically an object type characterization, which is shown here, and also material and environmental context. So here's the table for object type. Each metadata element has the same information provided in these mini tables. In the first row, we have an ESSDIVE proposed element. We're not using this quite yet, but this is more of a machine readable name and an indication of whether this is optional, recommended, or required. And the name is very similar to, this is the current name that we're using from the CSAR IGSN template. We also have a definition of that element, and then any requirements for the formatting. In this case, we have a controlled vocabulary. We're still using CSAR to register our IGSN, so we use this, but we have some recommended changes to the object type list that we can view here, and I'll go to that next. We've developed these based on comparisons to existing ontologies, and then also just our needs within ESS to better describe sample types. And then we have additional instructions and examples. So here's when you click on that link, you get this, you're taken to this object type vocabulary page, and we have a number of additional terms that we're recommending. And the purpose of this particular field is to just provide an indication of the general nature of the sample. In most cases, we're currently using individual sample. In this table, I have the ESSDIVE object type and then the current CSAR IGSN label. So you can see how we have these proposed terms, and we'd like some feedback on that still if you have any input on these. And hopefully we'll have a link to this vocabulary in the chat. Material is perhaps the most informative field for characterizing sample type. And this is just the material that a sample consists of, such as soil or water, different water types. So again, we have this proposed list, and we're using primarily environment ontology terms for our proposed new terms, and also have a few using the plant ontology. And what we needed to do was add a number of terms to better characterize water samples, organic material, and plant structures. And this table also has a link to the ontology identifier, the IRI is what it's called. So now I want to go to how you can provide feedback, particularly for some of these terms. When you go back to the main Readme page, below getting started, there are instructions on how to contribute. And you can click on this guide on how to contribute here. And there is some specific information, and what you can do is submit an issue, and there are instructions here on how to do that, and some issue templates. Or you can simply contact us at ESSDIVE support at lbl.gov. So we have issue templates for suggesting a new term, changing a term, or changing some aspect of the documentation to clarify or correct a mistake. So for submitting an issue, you can just copy and paste this issue template provided on the contributing page, then select submit a new issue, or a new issue here. We have a couple links there. And then that'll take you to a blank new issue form where you enter an issue title, you paste in the issue template and complete the details for the new term or change. And then you simply select submit a new issue, and then you're done with that process. So I'll just give a quick summary here of the resources. We have this, we have the GitHub link, the Git Book link with the more user-friendly view. And the primary content included within this documentation includes the metadata reference guide, instructions for registering IGSNs, the sample metadata template, and then guidelines for contributing, where you can provide feedback and recommended revisions. So I also want to recognize here that we do understand that providing data in these standard formats, particularly if you haven't done it before or used these formats before, will take some time and effort up front in particular. So our goal is to ensure that we make it as easy as possible and that the benefits are well worth the effort. So I want to outline some of those. The original purpose of this sample ID work was to better enable efficient tracking and integration of data from different user facilities. So with this persistent ID and the associated metadata, we can more fully document the sample history and can create these more powerful links between related samples that may exist in different platforms. It also enables scientists to use some of the future community sample tools as we publish data on ESSDIVE. For example, advanced search within and across data sets for a specific sample type or analysis, or looking for samples within a given location or a date range. So the persistent IDs and that associated metadata, it provides the building block that we need to do some of these things. And more generally, it helps us promote the reuse of this data through better preservation and improved discoverability, and enabling more automated data integration in the future. We are also working with broader efforts towards a multidisciplinary approach. And there are other groups outside of DOE and internationally that are starting larger efforts to support global sample search in the future. So just next steps, we're hoping that you can help, some of you might be able to help test out our new reporting format. We were previously using that guidance provided by Cesar, and we have this updated guidance and reporting format in GitHub, so we would like to start testing that out. So if any of you are willing to do that and provide feedback, that would be great, and you can email me. You can also just contribute by submitting issues on GitHub. And what we'll be doing at ESSDIVE in the near term is developing and putting out tools on this GitHub repository to help standardize and quality check the sample metadata. And in the future, we'll be working towards this Fusion database where we'll have more advanced search within and across data sets. So we're running a little low on time, but I have a quick poll that we can put in the chat. Madison, can you put that poll link in the chat? Do you all see this? Are you able to click on the poll link and view this first question?
It's working for me over here, Joan.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So the first question is just a free answer. What sample material types do you collect? And you don't need to use any controlled vocabulary, just provide some indication, and it would be interesting to see what kind of samples are represented if okay, so we have a lot of water samples. Probably should have used the free text instead of the word cloud, but yeah, that's interesting. I'm gonna move to the next question. Okay, this one's a little bit slightly trickier. I just wanted you to rank what resources you might need to standardize sample IDs and metadata in order of importance to you. And you can do that by either arrows near the specific choices. Because we do really want to make sure that we have the resources necessary to be able to do this as efficiently as possible. Okay, I'm gonna move to the next final question. This is just free text. Are there any other resources that you need or want for sample data management? And then also we can just open it up. We only have a few minutes now. If you could enter your response there, and then if you have any other questions for me or Rob, you can bring those up now.
Hi, Joan. Hi, Rob. Thanks. This is Danielle. Thanks for the great presentations. A question I was thinking about is I really like this idea of being able to iterate on the standards as a community. And I was wondering if you have thoughts about what happens when things change, if people have already submitted, organized and submitted their data in a prior version of the standard. Like how does that happen potentially?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we're still organizing kind of like version 1 for each of the reporting formats. And I guess when we've talked about it in the past, we picture the process of releasing like a big version 2 update to the reporting formats definitely happening over maybe a longer time span. Of course we can push the little spelling changes and all of that to GitHub and Git Book without disrupting the data that's already been contributed in a certain format, right? Those are easy to do. But yeah, it's worth thinking more about what it looks like when we release version 2.0 of these, even if it's a year down the road and people have already submitted and are missing a column here or there. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what other folks think, except for the idea that hopefully we'll have a good amount of time in between 1 and 2, and we're not making major changes like rapidly like that.
Thanks. Yeah, it's super complicated.
This is Chris. Yeah, I think it's helpful to be able to move the standards forward within, say, a major release. But as long as, so if everything in the 1.x release is backwards compatible with earlier versions of it, then it's great. So you're basically just maybe adding new fields that are optional as opposed to required. So everything that has been created prior is still compliant with the standard. And then when you're ready, to move to maybe a major change, then the 2.0 release could be a breaking change where everyone would have to move forward, would have to do work to move forward. But, you then create some sort of an upgrade path, a tool or something that will help people move to that new format.
Yeah, so what's already in, say, ESSDIVE, if it lacks this new column that we're adding in version 2.0, say, there can be a tool or a way to make sure that data still is like compatible with everything in the future. Yeah. I appreciate the input on that, Chris. Thanks.
I want to be aware that it's 11 o'clock Pacific time, so I think it's about time we wrap up. Thank you for all the suggestions. I think we have a few more in the chat. And it seems like we have at least a few follow-up conversations to have based on some of the feedback we've gotten. So thanks, everybody. And we'll be in touch regarding our next webinar for October.